It was the early hours of the 28th of November, 1944. The waters of Tokyo Bay lay under a shroud of cold mist, the surface barely stirred by the tide. Overhead, a half-veiled moon cast a muted glow, its light diffused through high clouds that blurred the horizon and softened the silhouettes of ships at anchor. Out in the darkness, a massive shape moved with slow, deliberate purpose. Her bow sliced through the water with barely a sound, her passage more felt than heard. This was Shinano, the pride and final gamble of the Imperial Japanese Navy. She was the largest aircraft carrier in the world, a warship so vast that no other navy had launched her equal. Conceived in secrecy, constructed under the strictest wartime security, and unknown to Allied intelligence until after her loss, she represented the last grand statement of an empire in decline. Shinano's story began not as a carrier, but as a battleship. Her keel had been laid down at the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal as the third of the Yamato-class super battleships, her hull designed to carry 18-inch guns and armor that could shrug off anything afloat. But the lessons of Midway had rewritten the rules of naval warfare. 4 Japanese carriers had gone down in flames in a single battle. The battleship was no longer king. The carrier was now the decisive weapon. And so, in the midst of construction, Shinano was reborn. Her immense armored hull was reworked into a carrier platform, her flight deck stretching over 800 feet, her hangars designed to serve both as a base for her own aircraft and as a supply ship for other carriers at the front. She was, in theory, unsinkable, protected by a battleship's armor belt and an armored hangar deck, compartmentalized against flooding and bristling with anti-aircraft guns. Now, in the darkness of late November, she was making her maiden voyage. It was not a sortie into battle, but a transfer. A move from Yokosuka to Kure Naval Base, where she would complete her fitting out and embark her air group. Her holds were loaded not with squadrons of aircraft ready for combat, but with crated planes, spare parts, and ammunition intended to resupply other units. She carried over 2,400 officers and men, many of them newly assigned and still unfamiliar with the ship's systems. She had been in commission for only 10 days. Japan's strategic position at this stage of the war was desperate. In the Philippines, American forces were advancing steadily after the Battle of Leyte Gulf, cutting the empire's southern resource lifelines. In the skies over the home islands, the deep, droning engines of the B-29 Superfortress had become a new and menacing sound, their bomb loads striking at the industrial heart of Japan. At sea, the Imperial Navy was a shadow of its former self. Most of its surviving carriers were empty decks with too few planes and too little fuel to operate effectively. The super battleship Yamato herself sat idle, her great guns silent for lack of a decisive mission. In this bleak context, Shinano was more than steel and machinery. She was a statement to the Japanese people, to their enemies, and perhaps most of all to themselves, that the empire could still produce giants. Her voyage to Kure was a calculated risk, undertaken with the belief that the coastal route southward was safe. Submarines were expected to lurk farther offshore, beyond the protective arc of Japan's home waters. The Imperial Navy's confidence rested on the assumption that American undersea patrols would not dare to venture so close. Shortly after midnight, Shinano eased away from the piers of Yokosuka. Her 3 destroyer escorts, Isokaze, Yukikaze, and Hamakaze, took up their positions, 1 ahead, 2 astern, their wakes curling white in the moonlight. On the bridge, Captain Toshio Abe watched the shoreline recede. He was a veteran officer, with experience commanding the light carrier Ryuho and serving as executive officer aboard the Shokaku. His orders were precise. Make best speed to Kure, passing through Sagami Bay, then westward to the Bungo Strait. Within her armored hull, engineers tended the turbines, monitoring pressure gauges and listening to the deep, steady beat of the engines. On deck, the night air was sharp, the wind carrying the scent of salt and cold iron. The flight deck stretched like a dark, armored runway into the shadows, broken only by the outlines of gun mounts and island superstructure. Beneath it, the hangar spaces echoed with the muted rattle of tools and the creak of stowed cargo. Many of the crew felt a quiet pride. Even incomplete, Shinano inspired confidence. Her armor was thicker than that of any carrier afloat. Her watertight compartments were designed to contain the sea itself. There was a belief, almost unspoken, that she could take a beating and survive. That sense of invulnerability had been built into her design and had seeped into the minds of her officers and men. But war has a way of finding the gap in even the strongest armor. Shinano's was not in her steel, but in her readiness. The ship's damage control teams had trained together for barely more than a week. Many of the pumps, hatches, and safety systems were still in testing stages. Her watertight doors were new, their seals yet to be proven under pressure. Japan's leaders accepted those risks because the alternative, keeping her at Yokosuka, seemed worse. American bombing raids on the Kanto Plain could reach the yard. If Shinano were damaged in port, her completion might be delayed indefinitely. Moving her to Kure promised both safety and the skilled dockyard labor she needed. The voyage was planned to be swift and uneventful. Yet even now, there was another presence on these waters. 1,000 yards away, invisible beneath the waves, an American submarine was patrolling. The USS Archerfish, a Balao-class submarine under Commander Joseph F. Enright, had been searching for high-value prey. For days, Enright had found nothing worth the risk of attack. Tonight, his patience would be rewarded. Shinano's officers, unaware of this shadow, focused on navigation and maintaining formation. The destroyers swept their sonar arcs methodically, but in coastal waters cluttered with fishing craft and patrol vessels, any faint contact could be dismissed as harmless. Confidence in their own shores made them less alert than they might have been in distant seas. As the hours passed, Shinano pushed steadily southward. Her great screws thumped a measured rhythm into the water, the vibration traveling up through the decks. Men off duty lay in their bunks, lulled by the engine's pulse. On the bridge, Captain Abe checked the course and the weather, his eyes adjusting to the darkness. The coastline slid by as a series of darker shadows against the horizon. To a casual observer, it was a routine night's steaming. The destroyers maintained their stations, the ship's course steady. But unseen, Archerfish was maneuvering, matching speed, keeping just outside visual range. Enright knew only that he had sighted a large, fast-moving ship. Its size and silhouette suggested something extraordinary. He would shadow it for hours, waiting for the moment to strike. Back aboard Shinano, there was no sign of danger. Officers on the open bridge scanned the horizon, their breath misting in the cold air. The wake of the great ship foamed faintly behind her, a pale trail vanishing into the night. Somewhere aft, a lookout turned his head at the glint of moonlight on the water, saw nothing, and turned back to his watch. The carrier moved on, her bow cleaving the swells, her bulk casting a low, dark shadow across the sea. She was a floating fortress, built for the decisive battles that Japan's strategists still dreamed of fighting. a battle that would never come. Beneath the quiet confidence of her crew lay the reality that the war had moved beyond Japan's capacity to shape it. The enemy now chose the place and time of engagement. By the time Shinano cleared the mouth of Tokyo Bay, the land was fading into the distance. The night remained calm, the escorts steady in their positions. Ahead lay the narrow approaches of the Bungo Strait, the final leg to Kure. Behind her, unseen, the hunter closed in. The voyage had begun without incident. The men on board could not know that they were already in the opening act of their ship's only and final chapter. The sea was calm, the air cold, and the carrier's engines drummed their unbroken rhythm into the darkness. In that stillness, the illusion of safety held. But safety at sea in wartime is a fragile thing, as fleeting as the tide, and it can vanish in an instant. In the closing years of the 1930s, the Imperial Japanese Navy pursued an audacious vision, a fleet built around superlative warships that could outgun and outlast any opponent afloat. At the heart of that vision stood the Yamato program, a series of super battleships conceived in absolute secrecy, each mounting 9 18.1-inch guns, the largest ever placed on a warship. These leviathans were designed to confront and defeat the United States Navy in the decisive battle that Japanese doctrine called Kantai Kessen, the single shattering clash that would decide control of the Pacific. 3 hulls were authorized. The first, Yamato, was laid down at Kure. The second, Musashi, at Nagasaki. The third, designated hull number 110, at the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal. She was to be the ultimate expression of the battleship era, built with massive armor belts over 16 inches thick and a displacement exceeding 70,000 tons. The scale of her construction was such that her slipway had to be rebuilt, and her very existence was treated as a state secret. Then came June 1942. Midway. 4 of Japan's frontline aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, went down in flames under the relentless attack of American dive bombers. In a single day, the balance of naval power shifted. Japan's carefully trained carrier air groups were annihilated, their veteran pilots lost in the sea alongside their ships. The battle was more than a tactical defeat. It was a strategic shock that shattered the premise of Kantai Kessen. Battleships, no matter how powerful, could not decide the war without the protection and striking reach of carrier-based aircraft. In the weeks that followed, the Naval General Staff faced a bitter truth. Replacing 4 carriers was beyond the capacity of Japan's overstretched shipyards if they followed conventional designs. But there was an opportunity. Hull number 110 was still on the ways, her construction well advanced. By abandoning her completion as a battleship and converting her into an aircraft carrier, Japan could field a capital ship faster than starting from scratch. The decision was made in September 1942. It was a radical departure from the Yamato blueprint. The conversion would retain the armored citadel and thick belt armor, giving the new carrier unparalleled protection. Her hangar deck would be armored as well, a feature absent from most carriers of the time. She would carry an air group of roughly 40 aircraft, not large by American standards, but she was also intended to serve as a ferry carrier, transporting planes, fuel, and ordnance to forward areas. This dual role dictated her internal layout. Vast storage spaces below decks for crated aircraft, maintenance facilities, and workshops. The work of redesign fell to a select group of naval architects and engineers sworn to secrecy. All references to her as a battleship were erased from official documents. From that point on, she existed only as Special Carrier Number 1. Access to her slipway was tightly controlled. Even many workers at Yokosuka did not know her true dimensions or displacement. When portions of her towering hull became visible above the yard walls, they were concealed under tarpaulins and scaffolding. Yet secrecy did not shield the project from the growing strains on Japan's war economy. Steel, copper, and skilled labor were in short supply. Allied submarine campaigns were cutting into the flow of raw materials from the south. The shipyard workforce shrank as experienced men were drafted into the army or sent to repair combat-damaged vessels. Construction slowed. Her launch did not take place until October 1944, and even then the ship was far from complete. There were also compromises in her design. The decision to retain the Yamato-class underwater protection scheme meant her internal subdivision was complex, but the carrier conversion required large, open hangar spaces that cut into this defensive arrangement. Additional anti-aircraft weaponry was crammed onto the flight deck edges and sponsons, creating more top weight than originally intended. Her air group, when eventually embarked, would be modest compared to the Essex-class carriers now rolling off American shipyards in numbers Japan could not hope to match. Still, in Japanese eyes, she was formidable. Her armored flight deck could, on paper, absorb the impact of armor-piercing bombs. Her side armor was thick enough to resist the torpedoes then in common use. She was seen as a ship that could take punishment, survive, and keep fighting. All the while, the United States remained unaware that such a vessel was nearing completion. Allied intelligence, through intercepted communications and aerial reconnaissance, had catalogued most of Japan's major warships. Yet Shinano's true identity slipped through the net. The shipyard at Yokosuka was well defended, and the carrier's unusual construction timeline, beginning as a battleship, obscured her purpose. Some analysts suspected that a large vessel was under construction, but few believed Japan could afford the resources for another capital ship so late in the war. It was only after the war's end, when captured documents were examined, that the scope of the project became clear. The pace of completion quickened in the autumn of 1944, driven by events far from Yokosuka. In October, the Battle of Leyte Gulf had ended with the destruction of much of Japan's remaining carrier force. Musashi had been sunk under the combined fire of American carrier planes in the Sibuyan Sea. The loss underscored the desperate imbalance at sea. By November, Japanese naval leaders were determined to get Shinano to Kure, where better facilities and experienced crews could finish the work. Her commissioning on the 19th of November was a subdued affair. She was far from combat ready. Many systems were untested, and much of her crew was newly assigned. Yet the imperative was clear. Yokosuka was vulnerable to American bombing, and keeping her there was a risk Japan could not afford. Kure's inland position, shielded by the mountains of western Honshu, offered greater protection. There was a certain irony in the timing. The same secrecy that had kept Shinano hidden from Allied eyes also kept her from benefiting from the scrutiny that might have identified her vulnerabilities. There had been no full-scale damage control drills, no operational shakedown crews to reveal flaws in watertight integrity. Her crew had trained in fragments, learning their stations in isolation rather than as a coordinated team. Yet to the men who saw her glide down the ways into the water, Shinano was a source of pride. Towering above her escorts, her armored flanks glinting in the pale autumn sun, she embodied the idea that Japan could still build ships of awe-inspiring size and power. That image would soon be tested in the unforgiving arena of war at sea. From the moment she left Yokosuka, her voyage was more than a relocation. It was the culmination of years of ambition, adaptation, and desperation. She carried with her the legacy of the Yamato program, the hard lessons of Midway, and the last hopes of a navy fighting to stave off defeat. And somewhere beyond the curve of the earth, though no one aboard yet knew it, an American submarine was already in position, waiting for the chance to write the final chapter of the largest aircraft carrier Japan would ever launch. In the pre-dawn hours of late November 1944, while Shinano's great bulk moved silently south along the Japanese coast, another vessel prowled the same waters, smaller, unseen, and hunting. She was the USS Archerfish, a Balao-class submarine of the United States Navy, 7,600 tons submerged, 311 feet in length, and armed with 24 torpedoes. Beneath the waves, her hull was steel gray and streamlined, built for endurance and stealth. Her captain, Commander Joseph F. Enright, was no stranger to these seas. At 35 years of age, he had already spent much of the war beneath the surface, first as an executive officer, later in command. Yet for all his skill, there was a moment in his career that had remained a wound. In November 1943, while commanding another submarine, the USS Dace, Enright had sighted the Japanese carrier Shokaku, one of the survivors of Pearl Harbor. Conditions had been perfect for an attack, but Enright, judging the range too great and wary of enemy escorts, chose not to fire. Days later, American carrier planes sank Shokaku's sister, and Enright's caution was noted. Officially, there was no reprimand. Unofficially, it was a mark he carried. Now, 1 year later, Archerfish was on her 5th war patrol, and Enright's first in her command chair. She had left Guam in mid-November, assigned initially to patrol waters near Tokyo Bay. Her orders were open-ended: seek out and destroy enemy shipping, with emphasis on capital vessels. American submarine doctrine by this stage of the war was aggressive. The patrol reports from Pearl Harbor's submarine force headquarters were blunt. Any opportunity to strike a high-value target was to be seized, regardless of risk. The crew Enright inherited was seasoned. Many had been aboard through earlier patrols in the Marianas and off Formosa. They knew their boat's capabilities and her limitations. Archerfish could make 20 knots on the surface, but barely half that submerged. Her maximum safe diving depth was 400 feet, though in extremis she could go deeper. Her 6 forward torpedo tubes and 4 aft could deliver a spread of Mark 14 steam torpedoes, weapons whose reliability had been questioned early in the war, but which, by late 1944, had undergone crucial fixes. Life aboard was cramped and monotonous. The air was tinged with diesel fumes and the constant tang of machine oil. Bunks were shared in shifts. The hum of ventilation fans was the background to every conversation. Yet in these close quarters, camaraderie ran deep. The men of Archerfish had spent weeks together in the shadowed control room, the narrow passageways, and the mess deck, where coffee was as much a necessity as oxygen. Their patrol began without incident. Days passed with nothing more than the distant hum of Japanese coastal traffic, small merchantmen hugging the shoreline under the cover of darkness. Enright's log entries were brief, noting weather, position, and the absence of worthwhile targets. But beneath the surface formality of the reports lay the crew's growing frustration. They had been sent into enemy waters with the hope of finding something worthy of the effort, and so far, the Pacific had been empty. Then, on the afternoon of the 27th of November, orders came from headquarters. Archerfish was to take up a new patrol station just outside the entrance to Tokyo Bay. The assignment was risky. These were heavily patrolled waters, crisscrossed by mines and swept by aircraft. but they were also the gateway for Japan's most valuable warships. If anything large left Yokosuka or Kisarazu, Archerfish would have the chance to intercept. Enright brought the submarine in under cover of darkness, running on the surface to conserve battery power. Lookouts scanned the horizon for the faintest signs of enemy movement, a wisp of smoke, a sliver of silhouette against the moon. In the control room, sonar operators listened for the telltale rhythm of big screws turning in the water. The crew's anticipation was sharpened by memory. The men knew of Enright's earlier encounter with Shokaku. They understood, without anyone saying it aloud, that their skipper was waiting for a chance to erase that chapter. Such chances did not come often. Most Japanese capital ships now stayed in port, too valuable to risk at sea without overwhelming escort. For Enright, the opportunity would require patience. Submarine warfare was as much about waiting as about striking. The hours stretched into the early morning of the 28th. Archerfish patrolled slowly, zigzagging across the approaches to Sagami Bay, her radar scanning through intermittent patches of rain. Every so often, a contact would appear, a small vessel easily avoided. Then the screen would go blank again. Just before midnight, the call came from the bridge. Radar had picked up a large contact moving south from Tokyo Bay. The range was long, the identification uncertain, but the echo was bigger than any merchantman. Enright ordered a course to intercept. Below decks, the crew moved with quiet efficiency. Men in the forward torpedo room checked gyros and warheads. In the engine room, the speed was increased, the diesels driving the boat hard through the night sea. The men in the control room spoke little. Every change in bearing was plotted and rechecked. Enright climbed to the bridge, the cold wind cutting across his face. In the moonlight, far ahead, a shape loomed. Long, high-sided, with the flat expanse of a flight deck barely discernible against the horizon. Whatever she was huge. In that moment, the patrol shifted from routine to historic. Enright had no confirmation yet, but instinct and experience told him this was no ordinary carrier. It was a ship he had never seen before, moving under heavy escort and heading into waters where the hunter's advantage could be decisive. Inside Archerfish, the crew sensed the change in their captain's voice. Orders were given crisply, without wasted words. The submarine would shadow the target through the night, staying outside visual range, waiting for the perfect shot. This was the moment they had trained for, the kind of encounter that could define a patrol and a career. For Enright, it was more than that. It was the second chance every commander hopes for, the moment to stand in the same place as a year before, but this time to act. Beneath the surface of the Pacific, the hunter had found his prey, and as the hours of darkness stretched ahead, the men of Archerfish prepared to write their own place in the history of the war at sea. By November of 1944, the Japanese Empire was fighting a war it could no longer hope to win. 2 years earlier, it had still controlled a vast swath of the Pacific, stretching from the shores of China to the jungles of New Guinea, from the Aleutians to the gates of India. Now that empire was shrinking by the month, pressed in from every direction by American naval power, air power, and an industrial capacity Japan could not match. The turning points had already come and gone, at Midway, in the Solomons, and across the Central Pacific. What remained was a war of endurance, and Japan was running out of both time and resources. The Marianas had fallen. Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, once thought secure bastions of the outer defense perimeter, were now in American hands. From the airfields carved into their coral, the great silver shapes of Boeing B-29 Superfortress bombers rose daily, their wings heavy with the weight of destruction. For the first time, American land-based aircraft could strike the home islands themselves, carrying their bomb loads across more than 1,500 miles of open sea. On November 24th, just days before Shinano's departure, the first of these raids fell on Tokyo. The shock to the Japanese public was immense. Air raid sirens wailed in the capital, and for the first time, the war's full weight pressed down upon the heart of the nation. To the south, in the Philippines, a decisive campaign was underway. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in late October had been the largest naval engagement in history, and a disaster for Japan. The remnants of the combined fleet had been hurled against the advancing Americans in a desperate bid to destroy the invasion force. Instead, the Japanese had lost 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and more than a dozen destroyers. The waters off Samar, Sibuyan, and Surigao Strait had swallowed ships and crews alike. It was the last time Japan's carrier force would mount an offensive operation. From that point forward, the fleet existed in name more than in fact. Fuel shortages compounded the collapse. American submarines had turned the South China Sea into a graveyard for Japanese tankers. Convoys from the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies were decimated, and even when tankers slipped through, their cargoes were often too small to matter. By late 1944, the situation was so dire that the Imperial Navy rationed fuel not by ship, but by operation. Many warships sat idle in port for weeks at a time, their engines cold, their crews drilling for a battle they would never fight. Amid this bleak picture, Shinano was a paradox. A massive new warship completed at a time when Japan's shipyards struggled to repair the vessels it already had. Her voyage from Yokosuka to Kure was born of both necessity and optimism. Necessity because Yokosuka lay exposed to American bombing from the Marianas. Optimism because in Kure, the Navy still possessed the skilled labor and specialized facilities to finish her fitting out quickly, to make her battle-ready before the war closed in entirely. The plan was straightforward. She would depart Yokosuka under cover of darkness, skirt the coast southward, and then turn westward through the Bungo Strait to reach the inland sea. Her escorts, destroyers with proven anti-submarine capabilities, would guard her flanks. In these waters, so close to the Japanese mainland, the threat was thought minimal. American carrier task forces had not raided the area in weeks. The prevailing assumption was that submarines would avoid the narrow coastal routes, preferring the open ocean where maneuvering space was greater and detection less likely. That assumption was rooted in experience from earlier in the war. The Imperial Navy's coastal defense zones, known as Shusen Kuiki, were patrolled by surface vessels and aircraft, and mined in certain choke points. To Japanese planners, these measures created a shield close to home. Large warships transiting between ports could, in theory, do so in relative safety. But by late 1944, the United States had changed the rules. Its submarine fleet, once hampered by defective torpedoes and cautious doctrine, now ranged freely across the Pacific, from the South China Sea to the very approaches of Japan's harbors. New radar sets, improved sonar, and the hard-earned skill of veteran crews made them predators in any waters they chose to hunt. The old boundaries no longer applied. For Japan's naval staff, the reality of that shift had yet to be fully absorbed. Losses to submarines had mounted, tankers, freighters, and even warships, but these were often seen as the price of distant operations. The home waters remained a psychological sanctuary. The notion that a submarine might linger undetected within striking distance of Tokyo Bay, waiting for a target as valuable as Shinano, was not given serious weight. The urgency to move her also overrode caution. In the weeks before departure, reconnaissance flights over the Kanto region had confirmed that American bombers could reach Yokosuka. An unfinished carrier, loaded with aircraft and munitions, was too tempting a target to risk in a daylight raid. Moving her to Kure, behind the mountain shield of western Honshu, promised relative safety until she was ready for combat. The transfer was scheduled quickly, and with that haste came compromises, in crew training, in equipment testing, and in the careful planning of the route. In the war rooms of the Naval General Staff, the decision was framed as a matter of calculated risk. The shortest route to Kure would take her within a few dozen miles of the coastline for most of the voyage. Coastal waters, they reasoned, would allow air cover from shore bases if needed. The destroyers escorting her, Yukikaze, Isokaze, and Hamakaze, were veterans of earlier battles, fast and well-armed for anti-submarine work. The combination of proximity to land, escort strength, and speed was considered sufficient deterrence. Yet each of those assumptions had cracks. Air cover was sporadic, limited by fuel shortages and the redeployment of fighter units to defend key cities. The destroyers, though experienced, were themselves short on fuel and would operate within tight limits to conserve it. And Shinano's speed, hampered by unfinished machinery adjustments, would be no more than 20 knots, barely faster than a determined submarine could manage on the surface. The result was a plan that looked sound on papers, but was, in reality, a gamble. It relied on the enemy behaving as expected, on the shield of geography holding firm. It did not account for the possibility of a lone American submarine captain, patient enough to shadow a target for hours, bold enough to attack under the very nose of Japan's coastal defenses. As Shinano prepared to leave Yokosuka, the greater war closed in from every direction. On the Chinese coast, American carrier planes struck at ports and airfields, cutting into the last threads of Japan's continental supply lines. In the South China Sea, wolf packs of submarines prowled the shipping lanes, sinking transports and warships alike. In the skies over the home islands, the B-29 raids were growing in size and frequency, their incendiary loads designed not just to damage factories, but to break the will of a nation. For the officers who signed Shinano's sailing orders, the logic was clear. Keep her moving, keep her out of sight, and get her to Kure before the enemy could react. For the men aboard her, the voyage was simply another task in a war of endless movement, another night at sea, another port ahead. None could know that the real danger lay not in the skies above or the land ahead, but in the dark waters beneath their keel, where a submarine called Archerfish waited with empty torpedo tubes, ready to be filled. In those final days of November, Japan stood on the brink, not yet collapsed, but past the point of recovery. Each decision was made in the shadow of scarcity, each gamble taken because the alternatives were worse. And in that climate of urgency and overconfidence, the stage was set for a meeting at sea that would be as brief as it was decisive. The largest aircraft carrier ever built would sail into history not in battle, but in a chance encounter that neither side could have planned, but both would seize. The night of November 28, 1944, was calm and cold along the coast of Honshu. A half-moon hung over the water, its light softened by thin clouds, casting a pale silver sheen across the surface. Out in Sagami Bay, the USS Archerfish moved steadily on the surface, her diesels thrumming in a deep, even rhythm. The submarine had been on station since the previous night, sweeping the approaches to Tokyo Bay for any sign of high-value traffic. So far, the night had been empty. Then, just before midnight, the radar operator reported a contact. It was faint at first, a long-range echo that stood out from the clutter of smaller returns. The bearing was steady, the range closing slowly. Commander Joseph Enright climbed to the bridge, binoculars in hand, and peered into the darkness. There was nothing yet to be seen with the naked eye, only the suggestion of bulk against the horizon. But the size of the radar return told its own story. This was no fishing trawler or coastal freighter. Whatever it was large, and it was heading south. Enright's after-action report, written only hours later, captured the moment in clipped but telling detail. Contact appears to be capital ship, altered course to shadow, will attempt approach if opportunity develops. The phrasing was precise, but beneath it lay a year's worth of personal resolve. This time, he would not let a prize slip away. Archerfish began her pursuit, running on the surface to maximize speed. At 16 knots, she could keep pace without strain. The contact held a steady bearing, moving in the direction of the Bungo Strait. Enright ordered the radar to be kept on intermittently to avoid revealing their position to enemy detectors. Every few minutes, the set flickered to life, confirming the target's position. As the range closed, shapes began to take form. Through the high-powered night glasses, Enright could make out the flat line of a flight deck, high above the waterline. The island superstructure sat well aft, and the ship's freeboard towered over the sea. Even at this distance, the sheer bulk of the vessel was apparent. She was unlike any carrier he had seen before. Below decks, Archerfish shifted to silent running preparations. Men in the forward torpedo room checked gyroscope settings, verified warhead arming mechanisms, and stood by for firing orders. In the control room, the quartermaster plotted both courses, theirs and the target's, on the chart table, pencil scratching against paper under the dim red glow of the nightlights. Enright decided not to rush. An attack in open water, at long range, risked alerting the escorts before he could line up an effective spread. Instead, he ordered the submarine to submerge and take up a parallel course, shadowing the target at periscope depth. At 60 feet, the sea closed in around them, the gentle sway of the surface giving way to the steadier roll of submerged movement. The periscope broke the surface only in brief, cautious lifts, its lenses taking in fragments of the scene above, the dark wall of the carrier's hull, the trailing wake of the destroyers, the shimmering path of moonlight on the water. Aboard Shinano, there was no sign of alarm. Captain Toshio Abe stood on the bridge, scanning the night ahead. His destroyer screen was tight, their wakes curling white against the carrier's darker bulk. The route was familiar to any officer who had sailed between Tokyo Bay and the inland sea, a coastal passage hugging the land. The charts showed no American activity in these waters in recent weeks. Abe's concerns that night were more about his own ship, the green crew still learning their stations, the delicate balance of machinery that had seen only limited sea trials, the careful navigation required to avoid shallows along the route. On Shinano's lower decks, life went on as it always did at sea. In the engine rooms, engineers monitored steam pressures and turbine revolutions, their hands blackened with oil. In the hangar spaces, men moved between stacks of crated aircraft, checking lashings to be sure nothing would shift in the swell. In the mess, Off-duty sailors took their meals under harsh fluorescent light, the air heavy with the scent of rice and fish from the galley. Back on Archerfish, Enright watched through the periscope as the target's course zigzagged slightly, a common anti-submarine measure. Each alteration forced him to recalculate. At times, the escorts dropped astern or surged ahead, their wakes slicing across his potential firing lanes. The key was patience, closing the range without being seen, waiting for the moment when the carrier would settle into a straight run. The hours stretched on. The moon climbed higher, its reflection lengthening across the sea. Each time the periscope came up, Enright noted the bearing, the estimated speed, the angle on the bow. These numbers, fed into the torpedo data computer, built the firing solution. But the spread would only be as good as the moment it was taken. In submarine warfare, timing was everything. Shortly after 2 in the morning, the range was down to just under 9,000 yards. The escorts still showed no sign of having detected them. Enright considered an attack, but the carrier's zigzag pattern continued, and the risk of a near miss was too high. He eased Archerfish back, letting the target draw slightly ahead, then matched her speed. The submarine would wait until the carrier straightened out, and she would, eventually. Even the best zigzag schedule had to yield to navigational needs. Above the waves, Shinano's bridge crew focused on the navigation lights of their escorts, the faint loom of the coastline off the starboard beam, and the steady rhythm of the voyage. The sea was calm, the air crisp, and the captain saw no reason to deviate from plan. In his mind, the greatest dangers were the unexpected mechanical failures that could arise in an untested ship. Submarines so close to Japan's shores were a distant, almost academic, concern. Beneath that same calm water, Archerfish waited. In the control room, the atmosphere was tense but controlled. The helmsman kept his eyes fixed on the compass repeater, making fractional adjustments to hold their position. The sonar operator reported the steady beat of the target's screws, a deep, powerful thrum distinct from the higher-pitched cadence of the destroyers. It was the sound of a capital ship, driving forward with purpose. By 3 a.m., the situation began to shift. The target's course changes grew less frequent, the intervals between zigs lengthening. Through the periscope, Enright saw the dark shape settle into a more predictable heading. This was the opportunity he had been waiting for. He ordered the boat to close to attack range, the periscope raised for longer intervals now, as he refined the firing solution. Every man aboard understood the stakes. They were in enemy home waters, within reach of shore-based patrols and under the guns of fast, capable escorts. A missed shot could bring instant retaliation, but a successful one, especially against a target of this size, would be a prize beyond measure. At 4 in the morning, Archerfish had closed to within 6,000 yards. Enright studied the target through the periscope one last time, noting her immense freeboard, the sweep of the flight deck, the position of the island. He could see the bow wave curling white under the moonlight, the wake trailing astern like a path back into the darkness. He lowered the scope and gave the order to hold position, letting the carrier draw just a little farther ahead. The time to strike was near, but not yet. The ocean between hunter and prey was silent. The only link the invisible trail of sound carried through the water. The thrum of the carrier's engines in the ears of the sonar operator. The faint hiss of Archerfish's own passage in the listening gear of the escorts, if they were close enough and sharp enough to hear it. Above, Shinano steamed on, her captain unaware that for the past hours she had been the focus of a relentless, unseen pursuit. The next move would decide everything. Enright's patience, the crew's discipline, the fragile thread of luck that had brought them into contact at all. It would all be tested when the first torpedo left its tube. But for now, in the still hours before dawn, the two ships moved together through the moonlit sea, one watching, one unaware. The distance between them measured not just in yards, but in the narrowing margin of time before history caught up with them both. For hour after hour, Archerfish clung to her prey's shadow. The night sea was calm, the air sharp with the cold of late November, and every minute brought fresh adjustments to course and speed. Shinano's zigzag pattern was deliberate, a textbook example of evasive navigation. Each turn meant to throw off a submerged attacker's aim. But Enright was patient. His years beneath the surface had taught him that shadowing a capital ship was not a matter of speed alone. It was a test of endurance, of holding position without betraying one's presence. The submarine's crew worked in silence, each man focused on his task. In the control room, the helmsman made fractional corrections on the rudder, holding a parallel track at periscope depth. The quartermaster plotted their position with each fresh bearing taken through the narrow lens. Sonar reported the constant, slow-changing thrum of the target's screws, a deep, rhythmic beat that cut through the ocean noise. In the forward torpedo room, men waited beside loaded tubes, checking and rechecking their settings. Every few minutes, the periscope would rise, a quick flash above the surface, capturing a snapshot of the carrier's position. Each glimpse was fed into the torpedo data computer, the electromechanical brain that would turn range, bearing, speed, and course into a firing solution. The numbers changed with every zig. Too early, and the spread would pass harmlessly astern. Too late, and the escorts would be on them before they could reload. Enright kept his voice steady, his orders crisp. Battery management was always a concern. Submerged at slow speed, Archerfish could stay under for hours, but high speed drained her batteries quickly. Running on the surface to recharge was out of the question in the carrier's immediate wake. One sharp-eyed lookout could undo everything. So the submarine stayed at periscope depth, her electric motors humming quietly, conserving power while keeping position. The physical strain was subtle but constant. 8 hours of shadowing meant 8 hours of mental calculation, 8 hours of keeping the delicate balance between detection and opportunity. Men rotated at their stations, but no one truly relaxed. The control room smelled faintly of ozone from the electrical panels, mingled with the ever-present scent of oil and the sea. Coffee mugs sat half-finished on chart tables, forgotten in the focus of the chase. Above them, Shinano steamed on, unaware of the predator below. Her course changes followed a pattern: wide swings to port, steady runs, then a matching swing to starboard. Enright recognized the rhythm. If the carrier maintained it, there would eventually be a window, a straight-line run long enough to close the range and fire. By the early hours before dawn, fatigue was beginning to press against the crew's focus. The sonar operator shifted in his seat, rubbing at tired eyes but never removing the headphones. "Contact steady," he reported quietly, the words carrying the same measured cadence they had all night. Then, just before first light, the opportunity appeared. Through the periscope, Enright saw the great carrier turn to port, then settle onto a new heading. Steady, unwavering, the bow wave spreading evenly from her prow. He glanced at the stopwatch. If she held this course, there would be time to close the range to within optimal firing distance. He gave the order to increase speed, the electric motors winding up as Archerfish began her run. The approach had to be angled, not directly behind, which risked being seen, but from a forward quarter where the spread of torpedoes could fan out to cover the carrier's length. The torpedo data computer clattered as the new figures were fed in. Target speed estimated at 16 knots, range closing from 5,000 yards. The destroyers were still in position, one ahead, one astern, one to starboard. The forward escort was the most dangerous. If it detected Archerfish's periscope or sonar echo, it could be on them in minutes. Enright ordered the scope lowered between checks, minimizing exposure. Each time it rose again, the image grew sharper. The immense wall of Shinano's hull, the rising sun beginning to catch on the edges of her flight deck. Inside the submarine, the tension was palpable but controlled. Men leaned in toward their stations, eyes fixed, hands steady. Torpedo tube doors were opened, the clank of metal softened by years of practiced movement. Firing gyro angles were locked in, spreads calculated to ensure multiple hits even if the carrier maneuvered after the first explosion. Enright studied the final periscope view before committing. The carrier's course was still steady, her speed slightly reduced, perhaps for navigation in the coastal waters, perhaps due to some internal adjustment. Either way, it was the opening he had waited for through the long, silent hours of pursuit. He called the range. He called the bearing. The fire control team repeated each number back to him, the ritual precision of submarine warfare sharpening every man's focus. In his mind, Enright could see the invisible geometry of the attack, the path of each torpedo, the carrier's projected movement, the points where steel and warhead would meet. The sun's first light was breaking over the horizon as Archerfish reached her final firing position. 8 hours of shadowing, of exacting maneuver, of holding the nerve of every man aboard, had led to this. The order to stand by was given. The next command would send steel and explosives hurtling through the cold Pacific toward the largest aircraft carrier in the world, and with it, perhaps, the redemption of a captain who had been waiting a year for this moment. The moment had come. After 8 hours of shadowing in the darkness, Commander Joseph Enright had maneuvered Archerfish into position. The periscope view filled with the massive, looming shape of the carrier, her bow cutting a steady path through the morning sea. The calculations were locked in. The angles were set. There would be no better chance. Enright's voice was steady, clipped. "Stand by. Fire 1." In the forward torpedo room, the first Mark 14 left the tube with a muffled roar, compressed air pushing the weapon into the cold Pacific. "Fire 2." Another hiss of release. "Fire 3, 4, 5, 6. In just over 30 seconds, 6 torpedoes were in the water, their wakes invisible from above but known to every man aboard. Beneath the waves, the Mark 14s ran fast and straight, their gyroscopes holding the programmed track toward the carrier's vulnerable flank. Each weapon carried a warhead of over 600 pounds of Torpex explosive, more than enough to tear open even a heavily armored hull. In the control room, the torpedo data computer ticked away the seconds. At 16 knots, the target would cross into the spread's deadly arc in under a minute. On the surface, Shinano steamed on, oblivious. The lookouts saw nothing. The escorts detected no sign of danger. Then, without warning, a sharp explosion reverberated through her hull. One hit forward, low on the starboard side, the shockwave ripping through compartments and shattering fittings. A second hit followed almost instantly, farther aft. Moments later, a third detonation boomed amidships, followed by a fourth near the stern. In the space of 90 seconds, 4 torpedoes had struck home. The carrier shuddered with each blow, her hull absorbing the impact, but unable to contain the damage. The force of the explosions tore open seams in her outer plating. Compartments that had been sealed against the sea now filled rapidly, the water flooding through passages and cable runs. On the bridge, Captain Toshio Abe felt the deck lurch beneath his feet. Reports began to pour in, confused and contradictory. Damage control parties moved to their stations, but many were green, untested in real emergencies. Watertight doors that should have been dogged shut were left open in the chaos, allowing flooding to spread beyond the immediate damage zones. Pumps roared to life but were quickly overwhelmed. Below decks, the reality was worse than the reports. In the forward engineering spaces, men were thrown from their feet by the initial blasts. Steam hissed from ruptured lines. Lights flickered, then steadied, running on emergency power. In the hangar decks, dust and smoke drifted through the air, mingling with the acrid stench of burning paint and fuel. Some survivors would later recall the eerie calm in the seconds after the last torpedo struck, a moment when the ship still seemed to be moving as before, when the magnitude of the damage was not yet understood. Then came the list. Slow at first, a few degrees to starboard, barely noticeable unless one looked at the horizon. But it did not stop. The angle deepened, and the men in the lower compartments felt the water lapping higher against bulkheads that were never meant to be submerged. Abe ordered counterflooding to stabilize the ship, but the flooding was already racing ahead of the crew's efforts. The carrier's massive size, which should have been her strength, now worked against her. It took time to move men and equipment between distant compartments, and in that time the sea gained ground. Archerfish, meanwhile, had already turned away, diving deep to avoid retaliation. The destroyers had reacted almost immediately after the explosions, their screws thrashing the water as they closed in. Sonar pings rolled across the depths, but Enright took his submarine down past 200 feet, rigged for silent running. In the control room, the crew listened for the telltale splash of depth charges, but they never came. The escorts had other priorities now, keeping their crippled charge afloat. Aboard Shinano, confusion gave way to grim determination. Damage control teams waded through knee-deep water, hauling hoses and shoring timber. Officers barked orders over the din of pumps and the rush of incoming seawater. Yet the training gaps showed. Many of the crew were unfamiliar with the ship's complex layout, losing time in the labyrinth of corridors and compartments. Some hatches were improperly sealed. Others were jammed by the shock of the blasts. In the machinery spaces, auxiliary pumps were brought online, but power fluctuations hampered their output. Communications between stations became erratic, as flooding shorted electrical systems and forced men to carry messages by hand. On the flight deck, the list to starboard was now visible in the tilt of the horizon. Crated aircraft and equipment began to shift, their lashings strained to breaking point. Eyewitness accounts would later describe the growing unease. Sailors in the midship sections could hear the rush of water through bulkheads, an unbroken, relentless sound. In some compartments, men worked waist-deep, passing tools and patches to stem the leaks, only to see another rivet line burst open under the pressure. One petty officer recalled the heat from the engines mingling with the chill of seawater, creating a dense fog that made it hard to breathe. By the first half hour after impact, Shinano had lost speed. Her engines still turned, but the extra drag from flooded compartments slowed her to a crawl. The destroyers closed in tightly, their bows knifing through the swells as they prepared to take survivors if the worst came. Abe still hoped to make the safety of shallow water, perhaps even beach the ship, but the reports from below told a different story. The flooding was not under control. On Archerfish, Enright finally brought his boat to periscope depth, scanning for signs of his target. In the far distance, he could see the carrier listing, her speed reduced, destroyers circling protectively. He could not know then that his torpedoes had struck the largest warship ever sunk by a submarine, but he knew the attack had been a success. 4 confirmed hits out of 6 shots fired, a result any submarine commander would consider decisive. For Shinano, the battle for survival had only just begun. The sea was pouring in faster than the crew could push it back. Pumps labored, men struggled, and officers calculated and recalculated the ship's stability. The steel giant that had left Yokosuka in confidence was now wounded and staggering, her fate shifting with each gallon of water she took aboard. Somewhere in those darkened, flooded compartments, the first men began to realize the truth. That the voyage to Kure might end not in triumph, but in the cold depths of the Pacific. And above them, in the clear morning air, the destroyer's lookouts scanned the empty sea, unaware that the hunter had already slipped away, leaving only the ocean and the sound of a dying ship behind. For the men aboard Shinano, the first shock of the torpedo hits gave way to the grinding reality of survival. The carrier's list to starboard had increased to several degrees, enough that men moving along passageways had to brace themselves against bulkheads to keep their footing. In the lower decks, the cold bite of seawater lapped at the knees of damage control teams, the level rising in steady inches despite every effort to stem the flood. Pumps were brought online immediately, their throbbing engines echoing through the ship's steel compartments. But the shock of the explosions had ruptured not only the outer hull, but also the arteries of her internal systems. Electrical circuits shorted under the encroaching water. Auxiliary pumps, designed to keep pace with lesser flooding, sputtered and fell silent as power cables hissed and smoked. The larger steam-driven pumps depended on intact boiler lines, and those too had been compromised by fractured piping and bent valve housings. Communication, vital in coordinating any damage control, faltered almost from the beginning. The carrier's telephone circuits failed compartment by compartment as salt water reached their conduits. Runners were sent instead, young sailors clutching written messages or shouting orders over the roar of machinery and the crash of shifting cargo. The distances on a ship of Shinano's size were immense, hundreds of feet of passageway between critical stations, and each journey took precious minutes they could not spare. On the bridge, Captain Toshio Abe weighed his options. The standard damage control playbook suggested one sure way to save the ship: run her aground in shallow water, beaching her to prevent sinking. The nearest coastline was close enough to reach within an hour at flank speed. But Abe's training and the ingrained traditions of the Imperial Japanese Navy pulled him toward a different choice: to beach a new, untested capital ship without exhausting every other possibility would bring lasting disgrace, not just to the captain, but to the entire service. In a navy steeped in the ethos of perseverance and sacrifice, turning toward shore now felt like surrender. Abe ordered the ship to maintain course for Kure. There, in dockyard hands, the carrier might still be saved. Below decks, that decision translated into more hours of desperate, punishing work. In the forward compartments, engineers waded waist-deep in frigid water, groping for valve wheels and trying to patch ruptured seams with collision mats. Men struggled to move heavy timber shoring into place, their footing treacherous on slick steel deck plates, In the hangar bays, sailors tried to shift the weight of crated aircraft and ammunition away from the flooded side, the crates sliding and slamming with each roll of the ship. The list continued to worsen. 10 degrees, then 12. The carrier's starboard side rode lower in the water, her port side propellers churning up white foam in the morning light. The destroyers alongside could see the change in her trim, the towering wall of her hull now leaning perceptibly toward them. For many trapped in the lowest compartments, there was no escape. Hatches dogged shut to slow the flooding became prison doors. The water came cold and fast, rising past ankles to knees and from knees to chests. In darkness lit only by flickering emergency lamps, men beat on bulkheads, calling for help that could not reach them without letting the sea claim more of the ship. Above them, their shipmates worked with mounting urgency, knowing that for every gallon they failed to pump out, the list grew and the odds of survival shrank. On the bridge, Abe received report after report, pumps disabled, flooding uncontrollable in several sections, the forward magazines partially submerged. Still, he pressed on, clinging to the hope that Kure's great dry docks and repair crews could reverse the damage. He knew the shame that would follow if Shinano never completed her maiden voyage. In the Imperial Navy's long tradition, to lose a capital ship in anything less than a fleet action was a failure not to be explained, but endured in silence. Hours passed. The ship's engineers estimated the flooding had reached more than 3,000 tons of seawater. Counter-flooding was attempted to level her trim, but the effort robbed buoyancy from other compartments and slowed her further. The once proud carrier, designed to make 27 knots, now struggled at a fraction of that speed. Her wake was smaller, her bow wave diminished, the sea beginning to creep higher along her flanks. Men continued to fight. In the number 3 engine room, a petty officer ordered his team to work in shoulder-deep water to keep one auxiliary pump alive. The temperature difference between the hot machinery and the icy seawater created a dense mist that condensed on steel surfaces and dripped steadily into the rising flood. In the mess deck-turned-aid station, corpsmen tended to the injured. Burns from ruptured steam lines, broken bones from the torpedo shockwaves, and the pale, shivering forms of men pulled from flooded compartments. As the morning wore on, a grim understanding began to take hold among the senior officers. The flooding was not slowing. Compartment after compartment reported water rising faster than it could be pumped. The ship's list had reached 15 degrees, making movement and repair work ever more difficult. Even if they reached the narrow channels leading to Kure, navigating them in this condition would be nearly impossible. Still, the work did not stop. Sailors jammed mattresses into cracks, nailed planks across buckled seams, and carried sandbags to reinforce shoring. They bailed with buckets when the pumps failed, the sea claiming each hard-won inch back within minutes. The sounds of strain were everywhere, the groan of stressed bulkheads, the rattle of unsecured gear, the pounding of boots in passageways slick with seawater. By midday, the truth was plain to those who dared speak it. Shinano was dying. Her engines still turned, but her heart, the watertight integrity that kept her afloat, had been fatally pierced. Captain Abe, standing on the bridge wing, could see the horizon tilted at an angle no ship of his had ever known. In that moment, the weight of tradition, of pride, and of duty bore down as heavily as the sea itself. Yet the order to abandon ship did not come. The fight continued, not because the outcome was uncertain, but because in the code of the Imperial Navy, it was unthinkable to give up while there was still steel beneath one's feet. Men worked in compartments they knew would be underwater within the hour. Officers calculated damage control plans they knew would fail. And somewhere below decks, in the cold, dark water that seeped through every seam, the Pacific pressed its claim on the largest aircraft carrier Japan had ever built. By the morning of November 29, 1944, the carrier Shinano was a dying ship. The list to starboard had grown to nearly 20 degrees, the horizon now sharply tilted in every view from her decks. Men moved with difficulty along passageways, bracing against bulkheads, clinging to whatever they could as the ship leaned ever farther into the sea. Water poured through the lowest compartments unchecked, and every ton that entered brought her closer to the end. At Oro 8 Hunquo, the destroyers Yukikaze and Hamikaze closed in, their decks lined with crew ready to throw lines and haul men from the water if it came to that. The crews of these smaller ships could see the enormity of the damage, the carrier's starboard sponsons nearly at the surface, her towering freeboard now reduced on one side to little more than a wall just above the waves. Black smoke drifted from vents and open hatches as flooding shorted electrical systems. Rescue operations began even before the order to abandon ship was given. Injured men were hoisted across by breeches buoy or carried on stretchers to the destroyers. Others climbed down cargo nets, timing their jumps to the heave of the escort's deck in the swell. But Shinano's size and the speed of her flooding meant only a fraction could be taken off at a time. Each minute saw her settle lower in the water. On the bridge, Captain Toshio Abe held to his post. Even now, he had not given the order to run her aground. The decision, whether born of tradition, hope, or the refusal to surrender the ship to the enemy's attack, was final. His eyes scanned the scene, destroyers darting in and out, lifeboats moving toward men already in the water, and the steady, merciless tilt of his own deck beneath his boots. By 09:30, the list reached 25 degrees. Cargo, machinery, and loose gear shifted violently to starboard, worsening the lean. Some compartments flooded suddenly as bulkheads gave way under pressure, sending torrents into spaces that had been holding out for hours. In the hangar bays, unsecured crates broke free, sliding and smashing into bulkheads, some crashing into the flooding below. Those trapped in lower decks faced their final minutes in darkness. In some cases, hatches dogged shut to contain flooding also sealed men inside. Survivors would later remember hearing pounding on steel from compartments already below the waterline, a sound that grew muffled, then ceased entirely. By 10 o'clock, the carrier's fate was beyond question. The list was over 30 degrees, her speed reduced to almost nothing. The destroyers now concentrated on taking off as many as possible before she rolled. Lifeboats and rafts were deployed in a widening circle around her, their crews scanning for any man who leapt clear. In the control rooms and damage control stations, the remaining officers tried to hold to procedure, relaying reports to the bridge, calculating rates of flooding, marking compartment losses. But it had become a formality. The sea was inside the ship now, and it would not be turned back. Captain Abe ordered all hands who could reach the open decks to prepare to abandon ship. The words carried through the carrier like a final signal. Men streamed upward through companionways, some pausing to help the injured, others carrying little more than the clothes on their backs. The flight deck was slick with spray, the starboard edge now so low that waves broke over it. At 10:57 a.m., with the list beyond 40 degrees, Shinano reached the point of no return. The great ship rolled slowly to starboard, the motion vast and deliberate. Men still aboard scrambled toward the high side, some leaping into the sea as the deck beneath them tilted toward vertical. The destroyer's sirens wailed, signaling the final moments. The carrier's stern began to sink first, drawn down by the flooded machinery spaces. The bow lifted briefly, the flight deck now a sloping ramp into the sky. For a moment, her propellers rose above the waves, dripping seawater into the air. Then the entire ship slid beneath the surface, stern first, vanishing into the depths of the Philippine Sea. In less than a minute, the water closed over the place where she had been, leaving only a scattering of debris, oil, and struggling survivors. 17 hours had passed since Shinano left Yokosuka, the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy's shipyards. She had sailed on her maiden voyage, and in less than a single day, she was gone. The largest warship ever sunk by a submarine in combat, and the only one of her class to put to sea. She had never launched an aircraft in anger, never fired her guns in battle. Of her crew of over 2,400 officers and men, more than 1,400 went down with her. Some were lost in the initial flooding, others trapped below decks, and many more succumbed to exhaustion or exposure in the cold sea before rescue could reach them. The destroyers took aboard as many as they could, their decks crowded with shivering, oil-smeared men. For the survivors, the shock was total. They had sailed believing their ship was all but unsinkable, armored like a battleship, compartmentalized to resist flooding, and guarded by escorts in home waters. Now, in the space of a few hours, they had seen her torn open and swallowed by the sea. Far away, aboard the USS Archerfish, Enright and his crew listened to the distant detonations and fading sonar echoes that told of their target's death throes. When the submarine surfaced hours later, the ocean was empty, save for oil and debris. In his patrol report, Enright recorded the sinking in precise, unemotional language. 6 torpedoes fired, 4 hits observed, large carrier sunk. It was an entry that would earn him the Navy Cross and a place in submarine history. But for those who had sailed aboard Shinano, the loss was more than a statistic. It was the end of a ship that had been built in secrecy, launched with pride, and sent into danger before she was ready. Her destruction in home waters, so close to the shores she was meant to defend, was a bitter blow to a navy already reeling from defeat. In the official record, the time of her sinking was noted simply, 10:57, November 29th, 1944. In the memory of those who were there, it was the moment when steel, tradition, and hope all went down together, leaving only the sea and the silence. In Japan, there was no headline, no public announcement, no bulletin to the people explaining that the newest and largest ship of the Imperial Navy had gone to the bottom less than a day after her first voyage. The loss of Shinano was classified at once, her name struck from any mention outside the tightest circles of naval command. To admit that a vessel of her size and promise had been sunk so close to home waters, and by a single enemy submarine, was unthinkable. Yet in the mess halls and wardrooms of the Navy, the news could not be contained. Officers returning from the inland sea carried whispers of a disaster. Surviving crewmen, quietly reassigned, told fragments of the story to trusted friends. Within days, the broad outlines were known inside the service. Shinano, converted from a Yamato-class hull, had gone down on her delivery voyage to Kure, hit by multiple torpedoes from an American submarine operating almost in sight of the homeland. For Japan's naval officers, the implications were devastating. The ship had represented a massive investment of time, material, and labor, scarce resources diverted from other war needs in the hope of fielding a carrier both powerful and survivable. Her loss confirmed that no matter the armor, no matter the compartmentalization, a capital ship at sea was never safe from a determined submarine attack. It also proved something more unsettling, that the U.S. submarine force could strike anywhere, even in waters once thought secure. Strategically, Shinano's destruction meant more than the loss of one hull. She had been intended to serve as a reserve and supply carrier, ferrying aircraft, munitions, and fuel to the smaller, fast carriers still in action. Without her, those already overburdened units would be stretched thinner still. The blow came just as Japan faced mounting American pressure from the Philippines to the Ryukyus, and at a time when every surviving ship was expected to contribute to the defense of the home islands. Psychologically, the sinking deepened a growing fatalism in the ranks. The war at sea had already turned against Japan in every theater. Now officers asked privately what hope remained if even the largest carrier ever built could not survive a day underway. In the rigid hierarchy of the Imperial Navy, such doubts were rarely spoken aloud, but they hung over every staff meeting and every planning session, an unacknowledged shadow. In the United States, the reaction could not have been more different. When Enright's patrol report reached Pearl Harbor and was decoded, the magnitude of the kill was not immediately understood. The submarine had reported sinking a large carrier, but Shinano's very existence had been unknown to Allied intelligence. Only later, through post-war records and Japanese testimony, would the full identity of the ship become clear. Even without that knowledge, the attack was hailed as a major success. 4 hits from 6 torpedoes fired was an extraordinary result, especially against a target under escort. Submarine Force Pacific Headquarters recognized it at once as a model of patient pursuit and precise execution. For Enright and his crew, it was vindication after weeks of uneventful patrol, and, for the captain personally, redemption after the missed opportunity with Shokaku a year earlier. The news filtered quickly through the American submarine community. In the cramped spaces of boats returning from patrol, crews passed the story over coffee and cigarettes. How Archerfish had stalked her quarry for hours, waiting for the perfect moment. How the spread had been fired in rapid sequence. How the carrier had rolled and gone down before her escorts could retaliate. It became the kind of account that other captains dissected, looking for lessons in positioning, timing, and nerve. When the details reached the press, the narrative took on an almost cinematic quality. Headlines spoke of a giant carrier sent to the bottom, a David and Goliath encounter beneath the waves. Photographs of Archerfish's smiling crew, fresh from their victory, appeared in newspapers from San Francisco to New York. For the American public, it was another sign that the tide of war had turned decisively, that the once dreaded Japanese fleet was now vulnerable even in its own backyard. Commander Enright was awarded the Navy Cross for the patrol, his citation praising extraordinary heroism in action against enemy Japanese forces. The wording was formal, but between the lines was the recognition that few submarine commanders would ever sink a prize so great. Archerfish herself would go down in naval history as the boat that claimed the largest warship ever sunk by a submarine. The loss of Shinano, though little understood outside intelligence circles at the time, fit into a broader pattern that was rapidly sealing Japan's fate at sea. By late 1944, American submarines had sunk more than half of Japan's merchant fleet and a significant share of its remaining warships. The combination of aggressive doctrine, improved torpedoes, and radar-directed attacks had made them the most efficient killers in the Pacific. In Tokyo, the Naval High Command analyzed the sinking in private. They noted the failures in damage control, the inexperience of the crew, the decision not to beach the ship when the flooding became critical. But none of those explanations could erase the stark truth that a single American submarine had penetrated their defenses and destroyed their newest capital ship within sight of the homeland. It was a truth they could not afford to publicize, for fear of further eroding public morale. For the men of Archerfish, the victory was tangible in the moment, a patrol that would be remembered, a sense of having struck a decisive blow. For Japan, the loss was one more step down a path from which there would be no return. The carrier meant to bolster the defense of the home islands had instead become a symbol, within the Navy, of the Empire's vulnerability and the unrelenting reach of its enemy. And for history, the encounter in the cold waters off Honshu on that November night would stand as one of those moments when preparation, patience, and chance converged, a hunter's skill meeting an opponent's fatal miscalculation, with consequences far beyond the men who stood on either bridge. Shinano would never launch an aircraft, never sail into battle. Her story ended before it began, written in the brief arc between the shipyard at Yokosuka and the bottom of the Philippine Sea, sealed by the torpedoes of a submarine that had waited all night for just such a chance. In 1945, the gates of Yokosuka Naval Arsenal stood open for the first time to foreign eyes. The war was over, Japan's surrender complete, and the once guarded shipyards now lay in the hands of the occupying forces. For Allied naval intelligence officers, it was an opportunity to walk through the heart of a facility that had, for decades, been hidden behind secrecy and coastal defenses. They came with clipboards, cameras, and questions, determined to uncover the truth about the ships Japan had built, the ones it had planned, and the ones it had lost. Among the most startling discoveries was not a ship still afloat, but the absence of one. On the slips and in the warehouses, they found fragments, massive sections of armor plate, dismantled machinery, and an array of shipyard photographs, all pointing to a vessel whose scale dwarfed any carrier in the Allied inventory. The blueprints, carefully filed in steel cabinets, revealed her name, Shinano. The sheer dimensions were enough to halt conversations mid-sentence. At over 70,000 tons fully loaded, she was unlike anything the Allies had imagined the Japanese could construct under wartime strain. In the early days of the occupation, rumors had already reached American intelligence about a supercarrier sunk before she could enter combat. Now, here was the proof. Naval architects and engineers studied the plans with a mix of awe and professional curiosity. The hull lines bore the unmistakable heritage of the Yamato-class battleships, reworked into a carrier form after the tide of war had turned against big-gun surface fleets. Her flight deck, armored against bomb and shell, extended the length of 3 city blocks. The hangar spaces below were cavernous, designed to store not just her own air group, but supplies for replenishing other carriers at sea. The blueprints told a story of strategic adaptation. After Midway, with 4 fleet carriers lost in a single battle, Japan had been forced to rethink its naval priorities. Shinano's conversion from the 3rd Yamato hull had been a desperate measure, an attempt to produce a ship that could serve as both a combat carrier and a mobile logistics base. She was to carry aircraft, munitions, spare parts, and fuel deep into contested waters, sustaining the fast carrier task forces that Japan hoped might still blunt the American advance. But the plans also revealed the compromises of wartime construction. The decision to launch her before her crew was fully trained, before her watertight compartments were adequately tested, had been born of urgency. The naval staff had pushed for her to reach Kure, where final fitting out could be completed, rather than delaying in the yards where she might be vulnerable to air attack. This haste, Allied analysts concluded, had made her vulnerable in ways no amount of armor could offset. Naval historians quickly began to ask the question, if Shinano had been completed earlier, could she have altered the course of the Pacific War? The answer, for most, was no. By the time her keel was laid in 1940, Japan's shipbuilding capacity was already stretched, and the industrial might of the United States was beginning to dwarf that of the Empire. Even if she had been ready in 1943, Shinano would have faced the same overwhelming American carrier air power that had doomed her predecessors. Alone, she could not have reversed Japan's strategic decline. Still, her design fascinated post-war analysts. The combination of heavy armor and aviation capability was unprecedented in carrier construction. Some American officers wondered whether such concepts might influence future designs. Others dismissed her as an overbuilt curiosity, a ship conceived for a kind of fleet action that no longer existed by the war's final years. The U.S. Navy, flush with Essex-class carriers and already looking toward the jet age, saw little reason to imitate her features. For the Japanese shipbuilders now working under occupation authority, seeing Allied officers poring over their work was a strange experience. Many had spent years on the project, laboring in secrecy under orders to speak of it to no one. Now, their carefully guarded achievement was being catalogued, photographed, and dissected by the very Navy that had sent Shinano to the bottom. Some felt pride that the Americans recognized her as a technical marvel. Others felt only bitterness that she had never been allowed to prove herself. In the archives of the Yokosuka Yard, Allied teams found not just blueprints, but a photographic record of her construction. From the moment her keel was laid beside those of her sisters, Yamato and Musashi, through the cutting away of her battleship superstructure, to the gradual emergence of a carrier's profile. In some frames, the yard was bustling, cranes swinging massive steel sections into place. In others, the war's toll was visible: fewer workers, material shortages, and the constant pressure of air raid alarms interrupting the schedule. These images, once locked away in naval safes, now became part of the intelligence record. Alongside them went assessments of her potential, not as a weapon that might have saved Japan, but as an example of how even a great engineering feat could be undone by strategic miscalculation, inadequate training, and the changing nature of naval warfare. In the cold, objective language of the reports, Shinano was described as a capital unit of exceptional displacement, sunk prior to operational deployment due to inadequate damage control and escort protection. Back in the United States, naval journals began publishing sanitized versions of the story. The public learned, for the first time, that the largest carrier ever built had been sunk by a single American submarine. The full dimensions of the ship, her tonnage, her armored flight deck, her massive hangars, became points of pride in recounting the victory of USS Archerfish. For veterans of the submarine service, it was validation of years spent honing their trade in the vastness of the Pacific. For Japan, the post-war revelations were more painful. The ship had been a symbol of hope in the late, desperate months of the war. Hope that the empire might still mount an effective defense of its home waters. Learning that her fate had been known and studied by the enemy was a reminder of just how complete their defeat had been. In official histories published years later, Shinano's story was treated with restraint, acknowledging her as both an engineering achievement and a casualty of the war's unforgiving realities. In the end, The post-war discovery of Shinano's secrets was less about what she might have done, and more about what her story revealed. She stood as a monument to the intersection of ambition and necessity, to the gamble of launching a ship before she was ready, and to the unforgiving environment in which the Pacific War was fought. On the drafting tables of Yokosuka, she had been the embodiment of naval power. On the floor of the Philippine Sea, she became a testament to the fact that in war, the measure of a ship is not in her size, but in her readiness to meet the moment when it comes. In the closing decades of the 20th century, the Pacific was no longer a battlefield. The waters where Shinano had vanished were quiet again, disturbed only by storms, currents, and the occasional passing vessel. Yet beneath that calm surface lay one of the greatest warships ever built, and one of the least seen. For nearly half a century, her exact resting place was unknown, marked only by a rough coordinate in the patrol log of USS Archerfish and the fading memories of those who had watched her do. It wasn't until the advent of modern deep-sea exploration that the possibility of finding her became real. The 1980s brought advances in sonar mapping that could scan the ocean floor with unprecedented clarity. Naval historians and maritime archaeologists began to speak of locating Shinano not just as an act of curiosity, but as a mission to recover a missing chapter of naval history. Yet it would take decades more, and the merging of undersea technology with digital imaging, before anyone could hope to lay eyes on her again. In the early 2000s, a joint Japanese-American expedition set out aboard a research vessel equipped with a multi-beam sonar array and remotely operated vehicles. The search grid covered a vast swath of the Philippine Sea, an expanse where currents, weather, and wartime navigational imprecision could place a wreck anywhere within tens of miles of its recorded position. Days passed with no success. Then, in the early hours of a calm morning, the sonar trace appeared. A massive, unmistakable silhouette, more than 250 meters long, lying nearly upright in over 4,000 meters of water. When the ROV descended through the darkness, its lights first caught the curve of Shinano's bow. Silt lay thick across her decks, but the hull still bore the lines of her Yamato-class origins. The great armored flight deck stretched into the blackness, interrupted by collapsed sections where torpedoes had torn through her flanks. On her starboard side, near the waterline, gaping ruptures were visible, the legacy of Archerfish's Mark 14s. 4 strikes, just as Enright had claimed, their scars preserved in the cold and pressure of the deep. The images were haunting. Gun mounts were still in place, their barrels crusted with marine growth. Sections of the hangar deck had buckled inward, evidence of flooding that had ripped through bulkheads in minutes. The forward elevator was frozen halfway between hangar and deck, a silent reminder of a ship caught mid-transition between readiness and ruin. Scattered across the silt were fragments of her fittings, ladders, cables, pieces of plating, all resting exactly where they had come to rest in November 1944. For surviving crew members who viewed the footage, the sight was both a homecoming and a wound reopened. One former petty officer, interviewed for the expedition, spoke softly as the camera rolled over the shattered starboard compartments. "That is where my friends were. We heard them shouting. We could not get to them." His words, carried across decades, spoke to the human dimension of what the cameras recorded, a dimension measured not in tons of steel, but in lives. On the American side, a handful of Archerfish veterans also lived to see the discovery. For them, the wreck was a confirmation of what they had only glimpsed through the periscope that night, the scale of their target and the precision of their attack. One crewman remarked that seeing Shinano lying silent on the seabed made it more real than any medal or citation. "We were just doing our job," he said, "but looking at her now, she was a giant." Historians who studied the imagery found details that deepened their understanding of the battle. The torpedo damage was exactly where Enright's fire control solution had predicted it would be, along the starboard quarter, striking below the armored belt, where Shinano's unprotected spaces were most vulnerable. The ruptures showed signs of inward collapse, consistent with rapid flooding and structural failure. The heavy armor of her flight deck had done nothing to slow the sea once it was inside. The wreck also told a quieter story, of the unfinished nature of her construction. Some sections of the hangar still bore temporary fittings. Welding seams in key compartments were rough, incomplete. In a navy already straining under wartime losses, such compromises were perhaps inevitable. But here, in the cold clarity of the deep, they were stark reminders that Shinano had sailed before she was ready to fight. The significance of the encounter between Archerfish and Shinano has remained a subject of reflection. In purely tactical terms, it was one submarine attack among many. One ship sunk in a war where hundreds met the same fate. Yet strategically and symbolically, it was remarkable. The world's largest aircraft carrier, intended as a bulwark of Japan's final defense, destroyed before she could launch a single plane. For the submarine force, it was a textbook example of patience, precision, and the decisive impact a single boat could have on the course of a campaign. The footage of Shinano's wreck has since become a fixture in naval documentaries, an underwater monument to the clash of technology, timing, and human decision-making. Her vast shadow on the seabed speaks to the ambition of her builders, while the ragged wounds along her flank speak to the skill, and perhaps the luck, of her attackers. For Japan, the rediscovery prompted renewed interest in her story. Museums and archives began exhibiting recovered artifacts and photographs from the Yokosuka yards. Former shipyard workers, now elderly, spoke publicly about the pride and frustration they had carried for decades. For the United States, the images served as a closing chapter in one of the submarine force's greatest wartime achievements. In the end, the deep-sea cameras revealed more than the remains of a ship. They revealed a truth about the Pacific War itself, that victory and defeat often hinged on moments measured in minutes, on decisions made under pressure, on the interplay between engineering and the sea's unyielding physics. No amount of armor could make a ship invincible. No reputation could make her untouchable. As the ROV made its final pass along Shinano's length, the lights caught the rising slope of her stern, disappearing into darkness where the silt swallowed her screws. Above, the Philippine Sea rolled on as it had for centuries, indifferent to the steel and stories resting far below. In the narrator's closing words, the lesson is clear. The sea remembers everything, but speaks of nothing. Ships like Shinano do not fade into legend. They rest in silence, waiting for those who will seek them, and in finding them, remember the cost of war.